everybody. Got it. I think my camera just went off. Just a minute.
I can see it.
See us.
Okay.
No, I can't.
All right, good. Well, good morning and a welcome to 3 wonderful sessions that Fred and I were just talking about. There are sessions, not a celebration, but of remembrance of a very, very tragic time in our country. Fred's calling it the Black Wall Street tragedy, and that's exactly what it was. And I would like to let you know that Fred really appreciates questions at the end of his presentation. And so if you have those questions, please feel free to use the chat as Kim has suggested. We are today going to be hearing about the mayhem of this time foreshadowed. And you remember that the end of the Civil War did not bring peace, peace. African Americans' hopes for achieving freedom, dignified first-class citizenship, and equal opportunity were really undermined and eventually slain by terrorist mayhem and murder inflicted by the white mobs. And you'll be hearing a lot more about that. Our speaker, as you know, Dr. Fred Johnson, has been an associate professor of history at Hope College, and he's been teaching there for 20 plus years. And prior to his work at Hope College in higher education, he was in the Marine Corps as a communications electronics officer and an infantry officer in the Marine Reserves. Graduated from Bowie State University and received MAs and PhD degrees from Kent State. And he is looking forward to, I know, sharing this information with you this morning. So our presenter is Dr. Fred Johnson.
Good morning, Scholars of HASP. It is so good to see you all. And now that the COVID restrictions are being lifted, I am so anxious to see you face to face again. You guys look great virtually. You look even better in person. So let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Just like Kit was talking about, I'm going to share the screen so we can all see what's going on here. And just like Kit mentioned, we're talking about the legacy of the Black Wall Street tragedy. Now, you all know that from the end of May to June 1st of this year, people were going back having a retrospective on what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma 100 years ago. And when Kit and I were talking about doing this, I knew that was going to happen, that people would suddenly be focusing just on what happened from May 31st through June 1st, those 2 days, those 2 tragic days, those 2 horrific days in the life of these African American and white citizens, these brothers and sisters out there in the area of Tulsa, Oklahoma. But to talk about Tulsa, Oklahoma is not enough, because when you speak about what happened at the Black Wall Street on those 2 days, May 31st to June 1, 1921, it sounds like it's too easy to presume or to conclude that it was just a single tragic incident, that bad as it was, thank God there was nothing as bad as that happened before. And my contention is that if you put it that way, you missed the larger story, which is Tulsa was the worst, but it was only one of many such tragedies. Tulsa definitely gets the recognition for being the worst race massacre in the 20th century and maybe in the entire history of the United States. But if you look at it apart from everything else that was going on before and after it, then you miss the fact that something was going on in this country before, during, and frankly, right now, that led to the possibility of Tulsa in the first place. So that's why I talk about the legacy of the Black Wall Street tragedy. And just as Kit read, the Civil War's ending did not bring peace for African Americans' hopes for achieving freedom. And look, I qualify this, not just first-class citizenship, but dignified first-class citizenship. and equal opportunity were steadily undermined and eventually slain by the terrorism, mayhem, and murder inflicted by white mobs. As scholars have asked, let me be very specific here. When I say terrorism, I'm talking about terrorism no less horrific, no less terrifying than stuff you heard about Al Qaeda, ISIS, the Ku Klux Klan, or any other terror group, the Black Hand, the Union of Death that brought World War I. Terror is terror. The fact that it's delivered by an American hand doesn't make it any less terrifying. So the terror that was inflicted upon this community and other communities that we're going to talk about was just as bad as anything that we have experienced or heard about in our day. Let's take a look at what happened. On May 31st through June 1st, 1921, a newspaper article ran, which said, "Nabbed Negro for attacking girl in an elevator." A Negro delivery boy who gave his name to the police as Diamond Dick, but who has been identified as Dick Rowland, was arrested on South Greenwood Avenue this morning by officers Carmichael and Pack, charged with attempting to assault the 17-year-old white elevator girl in the Drexel building early yesterday. Now, we must take our time and pick this apart. So, young African-American male arrested for doing what? Attempted assault on a 17-year-old white elevator girl. He will be tried in municipal court this afternoon on a state charge. The girl said she noticed the Negro a few minutes before the attempted assault, looking up and down the hallway on the third floor of the Drexel building as if to see if there was anyone in sight, but thought nothing of it at the time. A few minutes later, he entered the elevator, she claimed, and attacked her, scratching her hands and face and tearing her clothes. Her screams brought a clerk from Renberg's store to her assistance, and the Negro fled. He was captured and identified this morning both by the girl and the clerk, police say. Rowland denied that he tried to harm the girl, but admitted he put his hand on her arm in the elevator when she was alone. In 1921, 100 years ago, for Dick Rowland to be in the elevator with that young woman was in itself a tremendous risk. For word about the possibility of the allegation of him trying to assault her, that was as good as a death sentence. And the people in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for a long, long time, have been waiting for just such an incident to occur so that they could respond not to the alleged assault, but to some other things that have been going on that they absolutely could not stand happening in their midst. When that article was written, as John Milton said, all hell broke loose. But we had to ask the question, what really happened? What was really going on in that elevator? What was really going on in Tulsa, Oklahoma? What was really going on in the state of Oklahoma? What was going on in the United States, of which Oklahoma was a part, in 1921? It turns out that there had been a lot happening socially, economically, politically, culturally. And a lot of them had to do with some of the same forces that we're battling today, one of the biggest one, of course, being lies. Now, I trust that you all are at least familiar with, have heard about the thing that's being called the big lie relative to the 2020 election. Lies are words, and words are powerful. And the lies that have been told in the run-up to Tulsa, those lies could produce some dangerous consequences. In fact, those lies did equal danger. What were some of those lies? Lies, when combined with hate and fear and bigotry, you add all those together. Think about that. Lies, hate, fear, and bigotry. They equal a nuclear explosion of cataclysmic proportion for whomever is being lied about, whoever is being hated, whoever is being feared, and whoever is the target of all that bigotry. For example, consider what happened on August 7th, 1930. Now, we're talking 9 years after Tulsa, the worst race massacre in American history. And the combination of lies, hate, fear, and bigotry on August 7th, 1930 produced a cataclysmic nuclear, if you will, consequence on a certain Thursday of that year in that month. And on August 7th, 1930, these people in the community of Marion, Indiana, gathered together. Now, you will note that there are, at the top of the picture, where they're all gathered together, there are two sets of feet. I decided not to show the actual lynching that took place. It's good enough to know that two people are hanging in a tree. And there's some curious things happening in this picture on August 7th, 1930. And it's good for us to remember it's not August 7th, 1830, not August 7th, 1730, not August 7th, 1630. It's August 7th, 1930. You know, 39 years before men would walk on the moon. You know, 11 years before World War II would start for the United States. 2 years after the first transmission of the first color television signal. We fought a world war. Human beings have mastered flight. There's transatlantic flights that are going on. Radio signals are commonplace. People are talking about going to the moon, not as though it were some type of a science fiction possibility, but as a real possibility. So yes, it's about 100 years ago, but it's not the Stone Age. And yet, on August 7th, 1930, what we see here in this picture in Marion, Indiana, are a group of people standing there, pointing up in the presence of or witness to a double homicide. And in this picture, where they're all gathered together, they don't appear to be worried. They don't appear to be bothered. They don't appear to be concerned. They don't appear to be anything. In fact, they look to be having a pretty good time, as though it's just a night out at the park, just to have some extracurricular activity. You'll note that there were young among them. They're male and female, so it wasn't a situation where young people were more cruel than people who were older, or men were more cruel than women, or women were cruel than men, or older people more cruel than young. They were all out there. You'll note that the older lady in the bottom right corner, she doesn't appear to be bothered by anything. And then there's this guy. He's so intent on making sure that he's got a visual record of himself. He's pointing up at the two dead bodies. At what point in American history is it possible to be present at a double homicide and gather for a picture and be looking into the eye of the camera and have the picture taken, and you don't look worried, concerned, bothered at all? In fact, if you're the guy on the left, you're even smiling about it. What's going on in America on August 7th, 1930, that lets these people know they can be at the scene of a double homicide and be smiling about it, not be worried about it, not be concerned about it, not be bothered by it, to show absolutely not even the slightest thought, just another thing that's happening? Because on August 7th, 1930, the double homicide of Abe Smith and Tommy Shipp, two African Americans, it was just another thing that happened. Another thing that happened, like Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa was just another one of many things that just happened that was part of just of doing business in America, except in the case of Abe Smith and Tommy Shipp, it was two people, whereas in Tulsa, it was a whole community. So let's stop and ask a question. You know, I mean, what the heck was going on? As I mentioned, the people in that photo, they have no worries. Why did they have no worries? Why was it that they were able to gather under two dead bodies, two dead African Americans who had been lynched? Why did they have no worries? Why weren't they concerned? Why weren't they bothered? Why weren't they even the slightest bit annoyed at what was going on? Why wasn't somebody asking questions about, is there going to be a questioning, an investigation? Why weren't they doing that? How did things get to be that way? How was it that they knew they could gather together under a double homicide and know what they knew about not being concerned? Nobody would bother them. Nobody would arrest them. Nobody would hold them accountable. What was happening in America then and before then that led them to understand, to know with certainty that they could be there that night? You know, most people, when they commit a crime, are trying to get away from the police, trying to get away from camera. These people don't seem to be concerned about trying to get away, hiding their identity at all. In fact, they seem rather proud of it. So what was going on in America, politically, economically, legislatively, culturally, legally, that led them to that conclusion that it was okay to stand there and point up at two dead bodies and know it was okay, that they would never be prosecuted and not even minimally questioned. Who did they think they were? You see, because the two dead bodies, the fact that they were lynched by a vigilante mob, just like the vigilante mob that were rampaged through Tulsa, it all had to do with who the people that lynched them thought they were and who the people who got lynched were thought of as not fully human being, not worthy of full dignified first-class citizenship. In fact, so unworthy that you could deny them their lives. And it's been said that if you can take a person's life, what else is left? Not much. If you can take a person's life and not be accountable for it, if you can just willy-nilly have a vigilante mob action and have a double homicide and people gather together and take a picture and look into the eye of the camera boldly, with no worry, no concern, no thought about it, it seems as though that the message communicated culturally, societally, is that the two dead bodies, their lives were worthless, even worth less than a dog's. That you could dispense of them, do that to them because they don't deserve to live. That's the message that's communicated. And if they don't deserve to live, and you can take their lives, do they deserve to be educated? Do they deserve to be protected by the law? Because clearly that didn't happen. Do they deserve to have first-class citizenship? Do they deserve to have good housing? Do they deserve to have equal access and equal opportunity? Not equal outcome, but equal access and equal opportunity. Do they deserve to be treated like other human beings in a country and a nation demanding that it be identified as a Republican democracy? Do they? Is that their identity? Because who these people are hanging from the tree and who the people are beneath the tree, who they call themselves or who they're being called, has a whole lot to do about what happens to whom and who does what to whom. So we have to ask those questions. Well, let's start here. Because so many of those questions, why, how, what, who, they go all the way back to the Civil War, specifically the end of the Civil War. You know, during the first Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, a number of things that happened were significant in that they created the monster, created the social monster that would eventually engulf Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading through the details of this, but you know, the 13th Amendment passed by the Congress on January 31st, 1865, ended slavery. The specifics said that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to this jurisdiction. We should take note of the fact that Article 2 or Paragraph 2 of that same amendment of the 13th Amendment said Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Can we conclude that it would not have been necessary to put that second part in there? Congress shall have power to enforce this legislation, this article, by appropriate legislation, unless there had been a concern that it may have been necessary at some point to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. In other words, the legislators of that day kind of figured that, you know what, I know my country and I know my countrymen. They're not going to let this thing just stand by being unchallenged. So we're going to have to put something in here that gives us the authority to come in and enforce this article when people just take it upon themselves to violate it, you know, like lynching people. Then the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was passed to deal with the issue of citizenship. Specifically, we tend to forget sometimes, or maybe it's not mentioned enough, that at the end of the Civil War, there were 4 million Black people inside the United States. These people had not snuck across the border. They had not been smuggled in. There were no coyotes. There was some human trafficking, where there had been human trafficking, but not at that point. These people were born inside the United States, but they weren't citizens. In their very, very recent history, they have been property. So what to do with 4 million people who have not come voluntarily, they have not been trafficked, they have not snuck across the border, but they're here anyway. So the 14th Amendment was said, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state on which they reside. Dual citizenship. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. In other words, this law was focusing upon making sure people had access to certain things like life, liberty, property, and due process. Why? Because before they didn't have access to life, liberty, process, and life, liberty, property, or due process. So a law is generally passed to address a deficiency or a gap or an inequity or a need in a current social situation. Right now, with all the frothing going on in society about the vote, it looks like there's another piece of legislation being discussed right now to go back to the well one more time to address citizens' right to vote. Why? Because it clearly is not a done deal, apparently. Likewise, the Congress gave itself the right to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And just because you can never talk enough about voting, at the end of the Civil War, the 15th Amendment did two good things. Well, it did one good thing. It gave Black people the right to vote. The deficiency, though, was that it gave only Black men the right to vote, not Black women. So it left out Black women and it left out white women. And to be sure, white women did not appreciate that, especially Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. But if you're going to measure progress by inches, well, this was an inch forward in the right direction. The United States, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And again, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. But you know what? Even though you had 3 Reconstruction Amendments, one abolishing slavery, one guaranteeing or supposedly guaranteeing dual citizenship, another one that was going to address the issue of the vote, the franchise. And again, we cannot talk enough about the franchise because the people who want to deny the franchise, the people that want to keep the vote all to themselves, they recognize if they had any kind of love of democracy at all, that the path to power, and that means influence and money and legislation and justice in America, is going to be through the ballot box. So if you want that ballot box, if you want that power and authority to tilt in your direction, what you must do is you must corrupt the process of the ballot box. It was happening then, and some might conclude is happening now. So even with those Reconstruction Amendments, trouble was coming. And this is a summary of the trouble that was coming. Now, this particular picture was drawn, this poster was drawn in response to an organization called the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau, just to truncate this, the Freedmen's Bureau was an organization established toward the end of the Civil War. Its primary purpose was to provide services and support for ex-slaves transitioning to freedom. People who had been enslaved for 246 years by Abraham Lincoln's count did not have all the tools they needed socially, materially, to transition from being slaves to free people. They surely wanted to be free people. They had the intelligence to be free people, but things like education, land, managing money, all those kind of things. They once they learned it, they could do it, and many of them did know how to do it. But for the mass expanse of 4 million Black people, this was a massive undertaking. But look at how this particular poster takes that purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau and reinterprets it. You see in the foreground this somewhat goofy-looking Black man looking up at the sky. God only knows what he's looking at. He appears to be, he's drawn to be very large and to be very black and dark and lazy and looking kind of stupid for a reason. He's laying there doing nothing, apparently just enjoying life. Where in the background, off to the left, you see 2 white families who are smaller. What are they doing? They appear to be hard at work, taking care of life's business, dealing with the nitty-gritty of survival. Whereas in the foreground, this guy is just whistling and having a good time. How's he eating? How's he getting his clothes? How's he getting his housing? Who's taking care of him? The caption tells us, the Freedmen's Bureau is an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. Scholars of HASP, can I be blunt with you? That message of they're lazy and don't deserve it And if they do get it, it's going to come at my expense. That old message has been recycled and recycled and recycled, and it is in operation right now as I speak to you. But in this particular instance, in this context, it says the Freedmen's Bureau is an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. We work hard, they do nothing. And what's the result? All our hard work goes to them. Look at this guy. Does he look like he deserves all the fruits of my labor? What about me? How come no one's taking care of me? The Freedmen's Bureau twice vetoed by the president and made a law by Congress. And here's the salient point of the message. So, person looking at this, if you support Congress, then you support the Negro. If you sustain the president, then you protect the white man. So tribalism in the late 19th century post-Civil War period. If you do this, you support them. If you support that, then you support us. Us versus them. In the aftermath of the Civil War, with feelings and emotions being still as raw as they were, this was a very, very effective message, and it didn't take a whole lot of thinking to figure out whose side are you on. Are you going to support this guy in the foreground, this lazy, stupid-looking, good-for-nothing? You're going to support the people over there on the left who are working hard and taking care of business and just trying to live life. It's real simple. In that environment in 1866, something happened. This is just one of many such instances, but it begins our journey toward Tulsa, Oklahoma. Because as this historical marker shows us, in 1866, something happened in Memphis, Tennessee called the Memphis Riot. Bear with me as I read. On May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, so May 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 1, 2, 3 days, mobs of white men led by law enforcement. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, law enforcement, to include the National Guard, will either be standing by or be part of the mob that will rampage through Tulsa. In 1866, law enforcement. I'm trying to get us to understand that there are certain factors, variables, themes that happen in each and every instance I'm going to share with you. And in each and every instance, including the lynching in Marion, Indiana in 1930, law enforcement either stood by or a part of it. So when law enforcement is involved in these things, they do one of two things. They stand by and look the other way, or they're part of the mob committing the crime. Either way, though, the black people who depend upon law enforcement for protection know they can't rely upon them. They know that they are a vulnerable community. They know that their lives are worth less than that of a dog. They know that they can be hung from trees and people will gather beneath that tree and take pictures and smile and wave and point up, and that nothing will happen to them and nothing will be asked. And they get that way in 1930 because of incidents like, for example, in Memphis, where white men led by law enforcement attacked black people in the areas near South Street. By the end of the attack, the mobs had killed an estimated 46 black people, raped several black women, and committed numerous robberies, assaults, and arsons. In other words, this is a foreshadowing of the mayhem. One instance of the foreshadowing of the mayhem that will become all too commonplace in the 20th century, and which would be the nexus point for what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A congressional investigative committee, yeah, this is another thing we need to point out too. Usually in the aftermath of these things, there's a congressional investigative committee that's formed to investigate, well, what happened? You know, I mentioned to people that the last thing I want to do anymore, I just decided I'm not going to send any more study commissions, no more blue ribbon panels, no more investigative things to ask, well, how did this occur? The historical record tells us how it's occurred. It happens the same way every time. But in this instance, a congressional investigative committee reported that 4 churches, 12 schools, and 91 other dwellings were burned. Scholars have asked, are you following me? 4 churches. So what this tells me then as a Christian is that even when it came to the house of God, the creator of the cosmos, that place where people gather to worship their creator, even those weren't off limits. So I can take your mortal life, but now we're starting to cross into the realm of the cosmos, cosmic reality, spirituality. Their hate, fear, and bigotry, and the lies about the community they were attacking were so potent that even when it came to the creator, nothing was off limits, everything up for grabs. although no one was ever prosecuted. Another theme that we'll see in all these instances, to include Tulsa, Oklahoma, also with A. Smith and Tommy Shipp, and also with Emmett Till, as a matter of fact. No one's ever prosecuted. No one held accountable. Why did they do that stuff? Why did they get away with it? What led them to think they could do it? No one's ever questioned. No one's ever prosecuted. No one ever goes to jail. Although no one was ever prosecuted for this massacre, it became a rallying cry in the battle over nation's reconstruction, the Civil War. Ultimately, the outrage that followed the massacre helped to ensure the adoption of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Translation, had it not been for the massacre in Memphis, Tennessee, there's at least a question mark that the 14th Amendment may not have been adopted at all or not as quickly. So it takes a glaring tragedy for justice to be done. Not because it's the right thing, and every American citizen should expect that kind of justice, but you have to have the tragedy followed by the intended redemption with the passing of a law where we hope people won't do it again. It's placing a lot of hope in a history that doesn't necessarily merit that kind of confidence of hope. Well, let's keep going. If you bear with me as I read, in the late afternoon of May 1st, 1866, long broiling tensions between the residents of southern Memphis, Tennessee, erupted into a 3-day riot known as the Memphis Riot of 1866. The riot began, watch with me here, the riot began when a white police officer attempted to arrest a black ex-soldier. Because what we will also find out in the 20th century is that black military men who go out to fight in World War I and World War II, when they go to Europe to fight for democracy over there and come back and don't find it at home, well, they're kind of annoyed about that. But more than that, they have been given a weapon and they've been taught to fight. And they've been taught that America stands for goodness and rightness and democracy and liberty and freedom. And they have come home from the horrors of war and they're not in the mood to put up with the horrors of tyranny at home. Likewise, black soldiers who had fought in the Civil War to literally get rid of slavery were in no mood of being returned to a situation of slavery after the war. So when this police officer attempts to arrest a black soldier, and an estimated 50 blacks showed up to stop the police from jailing him, accounts vary as to who began the shooting, but the altercation that ensued quickly involved more and more of the city. The victims initially were only black soldiers, but the violence quickly spread to other blacks living just south of Memphis who were attacked while their homes, schools, and churches were destroyed. White Northerners who worked as missionaries and school teachers in black schools were also targeted. So we see here another theme. Anytime something like this occurs, our white brothers and sisters who are allies trying to help, they too get pounced upon because of the logic that says this: why are you helping them? You should know better. What dog do you have in this fight? What horse do you have in this race? You know what? You're supposed to know better, so your beating will be twice as bad. And so homes, schools, churches, just as would be the case of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Scholars have asked, are you getting an idea why I call this a foreshadowing of the mayhem? Because this is just one of a number of instances. The violence continued through the night as the targets now became the black civilians in the city. Memphis police and firemen openly participated. Memphis police and firemen, you know, the people that you need, that you call to put out the fire, they openly participated in the violence and looting. So black citizens could not count on them to stop the attacks and put out the fires in the African-American neighborhoods. I don't know about you all, but the only time that I've read about places where minorities around the world couldn't depend upon those who were supposed to help them, to protect them from hooligans and thugs, or to protect their property from arson and things like that, were situations like pre-World War II Germany, where a Holocaust was already underway. It's where you have a situation of tyranny where an entire society has just written off a minority community, and it's okay to just run roughshod over them and let it rip. Usually those are in societies where a dictator and tyranny have assumed the highest stage for the moment, and rule of law and respect for individual citizens' rights, and certainly no democracy, is a concern. And yet the strange dichotomy here is that inside of the United States, this democratic republic, there was a bubble of tolerance for intolerance and tyranny. How do you have tyranny coexisting with democracy in the same nation? These, again, are the questions we have to ask. So the patterns, Black civilians, vulnerability of Southern Blacks, Blacks killed, white people and white allies dying, rapes of women, houses and buildings burned as a result of the neglect of the firemen. And again, no arrests being made. If you have this kind of a thing going on again and again and again, and the police either look the other way or they're part of the mob and no arrests are making, or no arrests are made, no one's held accountable. If this starts in 1866, are we surprised? Shall we be dismayed? Shall we be naive and think that somehow or another that by 1921, when they got to Tulsa, Oklahoma, the message was not way out and people understood, whether they said so by whispering ear to ear or just knew that you could do this kind of thing to a community and literally get away with it. By 1921, this pattern was already set. And the people in Tulsa, Oklahoma knew this. They knew that they could go rampaging through that neighborhood and burn down churches, homes, and buildings, and rape women and murder people, that the cops would either look the other way or be involved, and no one would be held accountable. That fact was already well established as a dynamic in American society, which is how they did it and why they did it and continue to do it past Tulsa as well. The mayhem was foreshadowed, the mayhem was achieved, and then it continued on to Marion, Indiana, and then to Money, Mississippi in 1955 with Emmett Till, and into the 20th century, the late 20th century, and into the 21st. And then, after Memphis, in 1866, in a place called Pulaski, Tennessee, some men came together and formed an organization called the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the historical record shows that it originally came together to be a gentleman's club, a social club. And the recognized leader of the early Ku Klux Klan was a man named Nathan Bedford Forrest, a truly dreadful, vile human being who, despite his being a dreadful, vile human being, was one of the best cavalry commanders militarily during the Civil War for the South. He was a person that loved to fight. He was good on horseback, and he loved to fight, and he could do it well. Before the Civil War, he made his fortune by selling slaves. But this was the guy who was the early Grand Wizard, or whatever they call themselves, of the Ku Klux Klan, founded in Pulaski, Tennessee. Yes, the same state where the Memphis riot occurred. And if you're taking notes on this kind of thing, you may want to note this book by Linda Gordon, The Second Coming of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, and the American political tradition. And Dr. Gordon says the following: there were 4 iterations or 4 stages of the Klan. The first emerged in the South immediately after the Civil War. It was a terrorist group. I need to say that again. It was a terrorist group in the literal sense of the term. Their main activity was violence against African Americans. They, over time, lynched more than 4,000 Black people. Scholars have asked, what happens in a society when you can lynch 4,000 people and get away with it 4,000 times? Do you think that maybe at some point people might get the impression, hey, you can do this to these people over there and nothing will happen to you? And when somebody says, well, you shouldn't do that, they're human beings, the response is going to be, really? Who told you that? Listen, bub, you need to get on the right side of that explanation. And they had one simple purpose: to maintain white supremacy and to prevent Black people from being able to enjoy the rights of a citizen. Likewise, in Tulsa, the massacre, the arson, the murder, the rampage, the pillaging was designed to do one thing: to deny people the benefits of citizenship, material, and to make sure that they understood their place. You may be in America, but don't you get it? Don't you get it in your Black skull, your brain, that you are a first-class citizen? You'll be whatever I tell you you're going to be. And because you are seem to have forgotten about that and prospered in spite of all my crazy laws that are designed to keep you impoverished, here's what's going to happen to you. All they needed was the proper catalyst, a reason to do it. His name was Dick Rowland, who allegedly assaulted someone in an elevator. Later on, after the founding of the Ku Klux Klan in 1896, we're trying to figure out, how do we get to the stage where Tulsa can happen? How do you get to a legal, political, social, economically, cultural framework with these kind of things? People can just do this kind of thing and rush out over the law, rush out over people's lives, just rush out unchecked. How do you do that? Well, it happens like this too. The law got slain one more time in 1866 when Homer Plessy, an octoroon, that means a black man or a man that had 1/8 black blood in him. How they figured that out in 1896, I do not know. But according to the one drop rule, Homer Plessy was an octoroon. He wrote the whites only section of a train in Louisiana. He was thrown off the railroad car. He took the case to court. The court decided against him. He appealed and eventually made it to the Supreme Court. And in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the principle of separate but equal, the 14th Amendment was supposed to deal with African American civil rights and dual citizenship. The Supreme Court in 1896 said, well, wait a minute. We didn't really mean that when it came to equal treatment, that it meant equal treatment, that it had to be together. What it meant was equal, but it could be separated. Now, they did distinguish, like, if it's a violation of federal law, sure. But at the states can sit up and legislate whatever they want. States can take care of their own business. Scholars have asked, I want to ask you a question. If you're a black person in Mississippi in 1896 and you're being told by the Supreme Court, don't worry about it, let Mississippi handle your civil rights. Are you buying that? Are you feeling comfortable by that? If you are buying it, you should make another purchase. If you're feeling comfortable, you should be feeling very uncomfortable about that. Because in 1896, the last thing Mississippi, Louisiana, or any of the former Confederate states want to do is make sure that your rights as a black person, civil rights, that your citizenship, that is being recognized. It's the last thing they'll do, but it's not the top of their hit parade. One justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall Harlan, wrote a dissenting opinion. He said, the white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country. And so it is, in prestige, in achievements, in education, in wealth, and in power. So I doubt not that it will continue to be for all time if it remains true to its great heritage. He went on to say, our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. Now, the irony of what Justice Harlan is saying here is that John Marshall Harlan was from Kentucky. So here you have a Southerner who's saying our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect to civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. The law regards man as man and takes no account of his surroundings or of his color when his civil rights, as guaranteed by the supreme law of the land, are involved. He went on to say, the arbitrary separation of citizens on the basis of race while they are on a public highway is a badge of servitude, wholly inconsistent with the civil freedom and the equality before the law established by the Constitution. It cannot be justified upon any legal grounds. For Justice Harlan, a person from Kentucky, to be saying this in 1896, there's only one word that can be used for him: visionary and just a good citizen. If evils will result from the commingling of the two races upon public highways established for the benefit of all, they will infinitely less than those that will surely come from state legislation regulating the enjoyment of civil rights upon the basis of race. We boast, he said, of the freedom enjoyed by our people above all of the peoples, but it is difficult to reconcile that boast with the state of law, which practically puts the brand of servitude and degradation upon a large class of our fellow citizens, our equals before the law. Justice Harlan was only forecasting the future. The impact, the nothing that happened afterward, the lies that traveled as a result of what was going to happen in Tulsa. Mark Twain allegedly said, a lie can travel around the world and back again while the truth is lacing up his boots. The foreshadowing of mayhem, I mentioned lies, hate, bigotry, fear. Beware lies and more lies. Some of those lies that made Tulsa possible, well, one lie was that black people were lazy. You know, like that Reconstruction poster showed, the black man lay in the foreground, the hardworking, industrious white guys, white families in the background, the black guy laying there looking kind of goofy, staring up the sky, whistling, just living large, eating, drinking, being merry, and no idea, no care, no concern about how he's going to live. All he knows is that somebody else is doing hard work and he's benefiting. So one lie is that black folks are lazy. But no, that kind of doesn't square with the history, does it? Because even Abraham Lincoln said in his second inaugural address on March 4th, 1865, that yet if God wills that the Civil War, continues until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk. Now, on March 4th, 1865, the 16th president of the United States, his mathematics tells him that black folks in America have been laboring without recognition, without compensation, without benefit for 250 years. And yet, somehow, the rumor gets out, the preferred belief is that black people are lazy. And then there's this other rumor too, that black people are somehow stupid, buffoons, not intelligent, deficient when it comes to intellectual capacity. That particular lie was fed by things like this particular advertisement. This black person showing, or this cartoon showing a black person eating watermelon. And again, with no concern in the world. Let me share with you what the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the way they put it. Before it became a racist stereotype in the Jim Crow era, watermelon once symbolized self-sufficiency among African Americans. In other words, in the days immediately after the Civil War and then into Reconstruction, growing and selling watermelons was a way that black people could sustain themselves economically. In other words, be economically independent. But society took that and then reframed it, just like the laziness trope. They reframed it and turned it into a racist Jim Crow stereotype. Following emancipation, many Southern African Americans grew and sold watermelons, and it became a symbol of their freedom. Many Southern whites reacted to this self-sufficiency by turning the fruit into a symbol of poverty. For Tulsa, Oklahoma, we need to say that slowly. Many Southern whites reacted to that black prosperity and self-sufficiency. Instead of celebrating people being self-sufficient and getting prosperous, it became a problem for the larger society. So instead of doing something, just even leave it alone, they turned it into a detriment to abuse people with. Likewise, black prosperity and education and intelligence and elegance and class in Tulsa would be reframed to be a threat to a society that was determined to view black people through the lens of Jim Crow segregation. The cartoons continued. Powerful images that communicated black people's reliance upon, blind, almost insane love of watermelon. And the one on the far right, the panel on the far right, the poem says, "Who said watermelon? George Washington, Watermelon, Columbus Brown. I was black as any little coon in town, and eating watermelon, I can put a pig to shame for watermelon in my middle name." Now, let me be very clear here. The broken English, the bad English, the pidgin English for watermelon and my middle name, all of those become merged together. I mean, at some point, we don't know how, I can't tell you how, but at some point, all the idea of black people plus watermelon plus bad language, bad English, meaning bad intelligence, not smart, all that begins to be balled into the same stereotype. Watermelon, black people, dumb, stupid, can't learn, slow intellectually. Even in the 21st century, the watermelon stereotype found its way to be attached to President Obama. And this guy became the leader of the free world. Another lie that made Tulsa possible in Jim Crow segregation so powerful, so poisonously powerful, was this myth of Black sensuality. The fact that Black people were oversexed. Black men who just could not wait to have a white woman, and Black women who were willing to lay down at the drop of a feather. For example, if you take the movie Mandingo, made in 1975, the movie Mandingo, conjured by the minds of enslavers and auctioneers to promote the strength, breeding ability, and agility of muscular young Black men, the Mandingo trope was born. While under the violence of enslavement, a physically powerful Black man could be subdued and brutally forced into labor. Emancipation brought with it fears that these men would exact sexual revenge against white men through their daughters, as depicted in the film Birth of a Nation. Scholars of past, I must tell you that in not every instance, but in so many instances, one of the reasons why Ida B. Wells, African-American woman, would later on in the 20th century wage a one-woman fight against lynching, and she would appeal directly to white women, asking them to go to their communities, go to white men and say, stop using the belief, the stereotype that Black men are somehow, hovering over and can't wait to jump on a white woman as an excuse to lynch them. Dick Rowland was the young Black man in an elevator who, when that woman screamed, he could not get out of the elevator fast enough. So many people were lynched on the basis of he assaulted one of our women. And just as is pointed out here, and just a quick note, Ken Norton, the guy in this picture, the guy playing Mandingo here was Ken Norton, who was actually a heavyweight boxing champ who defeated Muhammad Ali at one point. In the movie advertisement for Mandingo, you can see from the movie poster, I mean, it is so ham-fisted. It's almost unbelievable to think that this is 1975 and this kind of baloney was being put out there for the public to see. Ken Norton was also a prior Marine. But what about Black women? We know that the image of the Black man was this oversexed creature that couldn't wait to get his hands on the master's daughter. But what about Black women? Women like Harriet Tubman, people like this woman in the middle, or this young girl on the right. Well, the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia up at Ferris State University, I recommend the trip up there if you haven't been, said the portrayal of Black women as lascivious, that is oversexed, always wanting sex, by nature is an enduring stereotype. The descriptive words associated with this stereotype are singular in their focus: seductive, alluring, worldly, beguiling, tempting, and lewd. In other words, whereas Black men couldn't control their sexuality, Black women, these temptresses, these demons, these beguiling creatures, could make a man do something that he wouldn't otherwise do were it not for the fact that he's powerless before them. These are cherished stereotypes. Historically, white women as a category were portrayed as models of self-respect, self-control, and modesty, even sexual purity. But Black women were often portrayed as innately promiscuous, even predatory. This depiction of Black women is signified by the name Jezebel. And then the fact that Black people were dangerous. I'm telling you all, scholars of past, all these stereotypes, these are the lies I was talking about. The lies about laziness, the lies about being stupid or buffoons, the lies about oversexed, the lies about being dangerous. All these things fed into the general equation that made Tulsa possible. So let's talk about that dangerous part. The dangerous part, how do you square that this community is dangerous when, for example, the gentleman on the left had his back whipped almost into not being recognizable to his mother. And the other two panels were commonplace during the antebellum period. How do you throw people into the bottom of a slave ship and have them endure that horrific voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, and then when they get to the other side and are sold from mother and father, children, sister and brother, how are they the ones being labeled? There's a reason why the African proverb says that as long as the hunter tells the story of the hunt, the lion will never have his day in court. It's all about who's telling the story. And then we get to 1915, where D.W. Griffith, the filmmaker, produced a film which was as a matter of movie history, was a stupendous achievement. As a matter of history, as a matter of social impact, it was a cataclysm. Because in Birth of a Nation, D. Deborah Griffith told a story after the Civil War, which showed, among other things, Black men, in this particular case, a character named Gus. Now, you should know, scholars of Hass, that the guy playing Gus is not a Black man. Gus is a white man named Walter Long in blackface. So even in a movie that was shot with the intention of defaming, berating, and otherwise casting Black men in the worst light, Black men couldn't even get a job playing themselves. But Gus, this renegade Black soldier, at one point during the film, tells the young white woman that he wants to marry her. You can see the lust in his eyes. He's urgent about this. He's determined to have her. She, of course, is frightened and takes off running. Gus takes off after her. He means to have her, to wed her. She's horrified, scared out of her mind. She runs at the side of a mountain, crying for help. Gus continues to come after her. He's going to have her one way, whether she wants it or not. And then, with no other alternative, she gets to the top of the mountain, threatens to jump. Gus keeps coming after her, and then she jumps. Now what happens? It turns out that the young white woman was related to an ex-Confederate officer, and when he finds out what happened to his relative, he's distraught. He's overcome. What is he going to do? These Black people, these Black soldiers, they've been stuffing ballot boxes. They have been running roughshod over, just decent white citizens in the South. We were only fighting for our heritage, our home, and our hearth. Why do we have to do this? They're out of control. These oversexed Black beasts. Something must be done. I know. They seized upon the solution. And that solution was the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan, D. Deborah Griffith, would restore order, sanity. It would put things back the way they should be. And Black people would know their place. And if they got out of their place, if they got uppity, they rose up, they tried to step beyond the boundaries set for them, we show them a thing or two. Just like Black people in Tulsa, Oklahoma, by being educated, by being prosperous, by stepping beyond the boundaries of Jim Crow segregation, by making Jim Crow work for them, have forgotten their place. Something had to be done to put them back in their place. President Woodrow Wilson has to go down as one of the worst presidents of the entire 20th century, if not in all of American history, maybe only second to Andrew Johnson and a certain other unnamed individual who has the worst record on race relations. He actually had Birth of a Nation shown at the White House, and Wilson was quoted as saying, "The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there has sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country." That's a quote from Wilson. And Wilson really should have known better because he was a former college president and a historian. In New York City, the Birth of a Nation promoters sent white robe horsemen. Can you imagine this, scholars of Hass? White robe Ku Klux Klansmen riding through New York City to advertise a new film about heroic Klansmen. Civil rights organizations like the recently formed National Association for the Advancement of Colored People challenged the film's portrayal of African Americans and unsuccessfully attempted to have it banned or censored. The most ambitious film ever made at the time, The Birth of a Nation, was a popular success. Scholars of Hass, when you have a nation and a group of people who, from the Memphis Riot of 1866, are being told you can lynch, murder, rob, pillage, plunder, commit arson, and nothing will happen to you. You won't be arrested, you won't be questioned. And then you get told a history, like it's a history that glorifies the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist organization. And then a nation that continually feeds itself lies that Black people are lazy, stupid, oversexed, and dangerous. And then history comes along, like Birth of a Nation, that feeds into all of that. Do you understand now why I say lies? the lies that were told about black people, it doesn't matter if the lie was a lie. What matters is that people believed the lie and then acted on it. This is why I'm emphasizing lie. With the big lie today, when it comes to the election or any other lie, the fact that people will believe it and act on it, that's what the danger is. So the lie that people wanted to act on, plus the lie that people and their actions are fueled by hate and bigotry and fear, made this a combustible combination that made Tulsa not a question of how could it have happened, but how could it not have happened. African-American writer and scholar James Weldon Johnson said of Birth of a Nation, it did incalculable harm to Black Americans by creating a justification for prejudice, racism, and discrimination for decades to follow. In other words, Birth of a Nation told people, you see, look what's happening. This is history. They wouldn't have put it up on the screen if it weren't true. We must do something about this. We must stand our ground and never let ourselves fall to the kind of tragedy that happened to the people in the film. And then in 1920, in a place called Center, Texas. In Center, Texas in 1920, another thing occurred. You see here a mob of people who have gathered beneath a body of a lynched Black man. And this one is even probably more egregious because not only are the different age groups, not only are the people in this film, not only are there people in this picture looking directly into the eye of the camera, not only is there a guy on the right who seems to be laughing, yucking it up laughing, but there are small children out here, guaranteeing that the next generation will be just as cruel or will have difficulty shaking the cruelty taught to them by their elders. In that crowd of people in Center, Texas in 1920, we can ask the same questions. Why aren't they worried? Why aren't they worried? Why aren't they concerned? How did they get to the point where they figured they could just do this and get away with it? What's going on with them? What was happening in this society in Center, Texas, in America at that point, that told them that beneath a very dead body that has been murdered by a vigilante mob, that they could get together and crowd together, take a picture, look directly into the camera and smile and know that nothing was going to happen to them? What's happening politically? What's happening legally? What's happening legislatively? What's happening economically? What's happening culturally in America that tells that mob they can do that and it'll be okay? What? Who were they? Who were they that had them conclude we are us, they are them, and we can do that to them, and it's okay because after all, they are who they are? Well, exactly who are they that they're talking about? Are they citizens? Do you treat citizens this way? Who are we to do this to them? Or is it really us and them? Truly, is it us and them? It must have been for them to do that and get away with it. Former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara once said, we see what we want to believe. And McNamara would know because, after all, for a long time, he saw what he wanted to believe in the case of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War that he later came to repudiate, and in his 80s, in his last decades of life, Robert McNamara, in a documentary entitled The Fog of War, Fog, F-O-G of War. If you have not watched The Fog of War, I strongly, strongly recommend that you take a look at it, because Robert McNamara is trying to purge the demons from himself about his part in the Vietnam War and the 58,000 American lives lost. But if in fact we see what we want to see, by the time you get to Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, Americans are seeing not what's in front of them, but seeing what they want to see. Because in 1921, the lies, the hate, the fear, the bigotry were routine in America when it came to how people saw Black people. People were seeing what they wanted to see. So it didn't matter that in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the Greenwich District, you had African Americans that owned cars like this. It didn't matter that you had African Americans who owned businesses like this. In 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it didn't matter that Black people had shops like this, clean, orderly, prosperous. People were seeing what they wanted to see and seeing what they wanted to see based on the lies that they had been told and been telling themselves, and the hate that had been nurtured since the end of the Civil War, frankly, before the Civil War, and the fear that they had been taught to have and grow about Black people. The fears of being overtaken, the fears of dangers, the fears of being oversexed or raped by Black men or being seduced by Black women, and the fears of crime and so many other things that communicated by The Birth of a Nation, and the bigotry, just a raw bigotry. People saw what they wanted to see through those prisms. And then the lies that people believed, and then most especially that they were willing to act upon. By the time you get to Tulsa, Oklahoma, all those things were prevailing to foreshadow the mayhem that took place. The same rule was in place on May 31st and June 1st, 1921, that had been in force in 1819 during the Missouri crisis, where Missouri applied for admission to the Union when it scared Thomas Jefferson so much. The eventual debate about slavery, he said, we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor, watch this, we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. You can let him go, but you can't do it safely. And in 1921, America still had a wolf by the ears that it couldn't hold and could not safely let go. And that wolf showed up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But I suppose there's always hope. But we need to remember, action was urgently needed, because there were the lies, the fear, the hate, and the bigotry. The lies that people were willing to act upon and then eventually did. People chose to believe and see what they wanted to see. There was the reality that would bring Center, Texas, and then Tulsa, Oklahoma. And then there was the other part that people chose to believe that their nation was a land of happiness and rainbows and unicorns. Well, that may have been the truth for some people, but it was not going to be the case for the citizens of Tulsa. It wasn't the case for the citizens of Colfax. It wasn't for the case for the citizens of Rosewood, Florida. In so many Black communities, it would not be the case in the 20th century, when mobs would go through pillaging, plundering, committing arson, raping, and murdering. And the police would either stand by and look the other way or be part of. And the fire department sometimes also would not do their duty. It was one or the other. I will now take your questions.
Okay, Fred. There's a couple in the chat.
Yes.
The first one is, what is the blackpast.org?
It's a website.
Okay.
And it's a very reputable website.
Okay.
So if you want to
Great.
go there to do some research, I recommend it. I'd also go to the one that says NMAAHC, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I'll send that, Kim, I'll send that to you.
I was gonna say, otherwise I can put it in the chat a minute. Hold on, let me, Okay. Jim, please explain what the term Jim Crow means or refers to. I'm assuming we're talking about Jim Crow laws and Jim Crow.
Yeah, Jim Crow was a body of laws and customs that came to dominate the social and cultural reality of essentially the Southern states after the Civil War. But let me be very specific here, scholars of HASP. It wasn't just the South. The South gets kicked and deserves to be kicked. I'm from Virginia. I enjoy kicking the South. It deserves it. But the North also had its own brand of Jim Crow. It was just as pernicious. It was just as poisonous. It was just as restrictive, just as oppressive, just as unjust. So it was the series of laws designed to make sure that America had its own version of apartheid. You get the guaranteed dominance of one race over the other, with the complete, if not complete, denial of, at least the diminution of civil rights and the exercise of constitutional rights and privileges. And the term Jim Crow came from a dance by a guy named, I think his name is Jim Rice. Last name was Rice, who did a song that went something like, every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. Every time I turn about, I jump Jim Crow. And the story goes that this guy Rice heard an African-American performer doing this particular song and dance one day. And like so many other things when it comes to culture, this guy thought it would be a good thing to do for white audiences in the 19th century. So he basically stole the act and dressed up in blackface and did it. And he added the shuffling gait, the bad English. In other words, he did a caricature of what he thought black people ought to look like, sound like, and move like. And that's what people came to associate as the kind of black person the ideal black person that you want in Jim Crow, and laws were passed to accommodate that.
I would just add too, for that person, that there's an excellent Jim Crow museum at Ferris State University. They also have a great website, so
Right.
you can learn more about that there. HASP has taken a trip there in the past. It's probably time to take another one. All right, next question is, Professor Johnson, what do you think could have been done to prevent 90 years of Jim Crow, given the lies, fear, hate, and bigotry of Southern whites and the apathy of Northern whites during that period of time?
The closest thing I can come to an answer to that is something that I heard Dr. Kevin Bales say one time. Kevin Bales, I think, is still he's the founder and the director of an organization called Free the Slaves. And I had Dr. Bales come to my foreign policy class a number of years ago, and we were talking about human trafficking, which of course is what he's involved in trying to stop. And Dr. Bales said that one of the things that he noticed is a big difference between America at the end of the Civil War, as opposed to South Africa at the end of apartheid, was that the South Africans did something which certainly did not fix everything, because South Africa still has a tremendous number of problems. But the one thing that South Africa did, which he thought was a really good thing, was that after apartheid, something was established called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there were people in the African National Congress that the South African government called terrorists, and people in the South African government that, of course, people in the ANC called terrorists, but they're all invited to come to different sites around the nation of South Africa and tell their story. My relative was kidnapped and tortured in XYZ, or I was part of the South African security forces and I did this. Come forward, tell their stories, and make an apology or get an apology, and there will be no punishment. But what people wanted, what Dr. Bales said was that people wanted was the acknowledgement, the recognition, this is what happened to me. Not to just have it swept up under the rug. The reason we're talking about Tulsa, Oklahoma is because for 100 years, it simply was ignored. It happened, then went away. And so Dr. Bales said, the South Africans said, we don't want to hide any of this. We're putting it out there. If you did it, then admit it. And we will simply take your apology as sincere and heartfelt and try to get on with building our nation. Dr. Bales, Kim, said that if America had done that at the end of the Civil War, and had that kind of coming of heart and mind, who knows if it would have resolved every other problem we've had, but he is of the opinion it would have resolved so many things that we continue to talk about today. I even talked to somebody recently, a good friend of mine, and she was sharing with me that friends of hers told her, in a conversation at a local restaurant, well, for goodness sake, slavery ended in 1865. Why are these people still talking about it? How come they just can't let it go? Well, we're still talking about it because we haven't had the conversation yet that we need to have about it. And there's been a lot that's happened on top of that. So here's the thing. Just like we would never tell a rape victim, oh, just get over it. That happened a long time ago when you were, 16, 14? No, you're 36 now. You're an adult. No, those kind of traumas don't just go away. You learn to live with them and get on with life, but you still got to deal with them. Likewise, as a nation, we have been traumatized by 246 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow. We are only just coming out of the civil rights movement, which is being rolled back, at least as far as voting goes. And this is recent history in our time. So we have the conversation and then come to a meeting of the minds where, and the way that I try to facilitate the conversation like this is like this, Kim. I tell the students in my slavery and race class that if you did not own slaves in 1843, then don't be responsible for that. Don't be responsible for what someone did in 1843. But if you're treating somebody like dirt today in 2021, that's a different discussion. So I'm not trying to say, if you're white, you're responsible. I do not subscribe to that logic. It's illogical, it's irrational, it's unfair, it's stupid, and it's divisive. However, I do say that we need to confront our history and own it so that we can understand it, know about it, and then once we know it, once we own it, once we know about it and own it, we can do something about the present upon which it's been built. A bad foundation is not good for the building standing upon that foundation. It goes back to a biblical story, right? The man that built his house on sand as opposed to one that built his house on stone. When the waves of social discontent hit, the house built on sand will wash away. We want our house built on good historical stone. So when the waves come, we can stand up to them and say, not here today, not right now.
Thanks. That reminds me, some of those comments you just made remind me of from that Summit on Racism conference last week. In one of the workshops, the person asked us to all consider how racism affects our overall humanity, and to really think about what things we were taught in the context of our own lives growing up or in the communities that we were in, what things we were taught to fear, and by whom and why, and whether we could still justify that. It's a very good question. Okay, let's see. Next question.
One of the things, Kim, that I had to confront. As a kid that spent the first 10 years of my life in the Philippines, my whole understanding of the United States was, America, helped win World War II. We're in Vietnam to fight communism and war for freedom. So, for me, America was a place where people couldn't wait to get there to enjoy the fruits and benefits of liberty and freedom. And I believe that. So when I got there and certain things started happening in the South, I thought, wow, this is different. This is not what I was told this place was.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that what I've done is I only realized recently, I think I spent the better part of my life trying to help shape this nation into the reality of the image that I was first given. It was a good vision. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. We, the people of the United States, those are good things to achieve.
Right.
We simply need help. And I'm hoping that I can push the needle forward toward those objectives before my clock runs out.
You are. That relates to this question, which is what can be our best teaching method to help people see more clearly and to really see our blind spots today regarding vaccines, partisan politics, propaganda of so many sorts, etc. Okay, in answer to what's the first part of that question, Kim? What can be our best teaching method to help people see more clearly?
Okay, the first thing I would recommend that you all do is take a class by Fred Johnson.
That's what I tell my daughters.
But I would also say that, I kept on mentioning lies, hate, fear, bigotry. Yeah, the hate is problematic. Fear is clearly problematic, and bigotry is problematic. But I think that one of the biggest things that we're confronting today are the lies. The lies and people's willingness to believe them. So, it's been said that I forgot the person that said it, so I'm going to mess up the quote, but they say, you may be entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And so we had to do this on a one-on-one basis. I have friends of mine, I have relatives of mine who they too are believers of the big lie. And I simply had to be patient with them and say, look, you know what? Where are you getting your information from? Are you thinking critically about this? Are you using more than just one source? I don't care if your source is MSNBC and that's a problem. If your source is Fox and that's all that it is, that's a problem. You should be reading the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal. You should be looking at Fox News, MSNBC, and CNN, and everything in between, Al Jazeera. Sample as many sources as you can. Because what's at stake right now? The lie about the election. And this is what I kept on talking about. It doesn't matter if a lie is a lie. We shouldn't just be saying when they go like, well, you know, it's a lie. How much harm can it be? The harm is this. When people are willing to act on a lie, think January 6, 2021. A whole mob of people who were willing to assault the Capitol, the seat of democracy, the Senate, the world's longest, most esteemed deliberative body on the planet. A mob of people were willing to believe a lie and act on that lie. That's what we have to be concerned about. People's willingness to believe the lie. So we must attack the lie and attack it again and again and again, because clearly there are people out there willing to believe it, take their advice from it, and then move on it. And if we don't do something about that, this democracy is going to have some problems.
Mhm. Does have problems.
Is that a course that you think you might be teaching at some point, Fred?
If my half scholars want it, I'll teach it.
Oh, my
That's related
goodness.
to the next question, which is a House member saying, referring to the objection to critical race theory and how ridiculous that is to her. And how do you understand this?
You know, it's a very interesting discussion that's going on about critical race theory right now. And here's the thing that I've noticed about it. The people who object to it, and let me just say, I don't subscribe to that, okay? But it seems to me that their biggest objections are, well, you know, you're telling me that all white people are racist. No, that's not true. Critical race theory, I think asserts that. But Kim, it's very interesting to me that the people who are opposed to this, at least I watched one YouTube, you know, a so-called expert from the Manhattan Institute said, let me tell you why this is a bad thing. So I said, okay, tell me why critical race theory is a bad thing. So the video starts, he starts talking about, well, you know, when Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, I said, wait, brother, hold on a second. Wait. We talking about Marxism or critical race theory? Well, you see, they use Marxism because you see, if you want to make Americans' hair catch on fire, even Americans with not much hair, if you want to make their hair catch on fire, mention communism. Just mention communism. People have a reflexive reaction. Oh, communism. And you know what? They should, because everywhere communism has been tried in the world, Stalin's communism, Lenin's communism, Mao communism, whether it be China, Cuba, Castro, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or Daniel Ortega in 1970 Nicaragua, it has been an unmitigated, flagrant, flaming disaster. Okay, so fine, communism doesn't work. But I'm gonna tell you why I don't waste my time and stay up at night worried about communism. One of the tenets of communism is this: from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. In other words, we're going to treat each other with decency, dignity, and respect, and all be equal, like equally valued human beings. Now, from my faith position, I go, really? Is that right? Because I know a certain guy that said the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. So I tell myself, gee, if the master of the universe, to whom all creation came through, you know, Book of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and all things were made through him. If he said, second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself, in other words, I'm supposed to treat my neighbor with the same dignity, decency that I will for myself, gee, we're not obeying him. Why would I pay attention to Karl Marx? So when it comes from the cosmos, we're not doing it. And this nation has commoditized humanity from the very start. So the big problem with critical race theory is that they peg it to communism, and that is to make sure people are frightened. And they say that it's an attempt to overthrow the government. I don't know what the people who are behind it are trying to accomplish, you know, but I do know that one tenet of it is that it also asserts that the laws and the economy of the United States have throughout the greater part of this history been trajectory, or the trajectory has been to benefit the larger demographic ethnic group. Now, if you teach history, if you teach it with integrity, you reach that conclusion. But I don't necessarily subscribe to that, the CRT, because it's trying to make history do something. It's trying to bend history toward a certain conclusion. My feeling, Kim, you simply just teach the history. If you
Right.
teach the history and teach critical thinking, people will reach the conclusion that they need to reach on their own without the indoctrination.
Well, related to that, a person just wrote in that they would love to see a class that discusses the 1619 project versus most of us were taught in school, versus what most of us were taught in school. So there's
Sure.
another idea.
And you know, the whole thing, the criticism that I've seen of the 1619 project, you know, has been that, well, you know, the American Revolution was fought to maintain slavery. Well, you know, this is the problem that we have again, when you can't just like certain parts of history and go like, well, I don't like that part, so we're not going to talk about it. No, remember the big controversy about the Confederate statues? I was of the opinion that those statues should be left in place, not exalted, but put something around them and be used as a teaching opportunity, right? So that people can understand that a statue erected in 1925 had nothing to do with the Civil War, but had everything to do with the bigots in 1925 who were hearkening back to a history that never happened to say, well, back in the good old days, no, friend, you weren't alive in the good old days of the South. What you want to do is you want to borrow that history to impose your racism in 1925. That's the lesson right there. This is not the Soviet Union, where every 25 years somebody comes to power and you rewrite the history books. This is the United States. The history is a sacred thing. It should, and you tell it as it happened. Again, I mentioned to my HASP scholars, that's why when people come into my office, I have pictures of Confederate Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and Jefferson Davis, in addition to Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. It's not because I want to confuse people. It's to let folk know that I'm teaching all the history and that I'm not picking it, I'm not cherry picking it. These people fought against their government, and I tell them that. But before Robert E. Lee turned his back on his government, he was one of the most highly decorated and well thought of officers in the United States. How am I helping my students if I don't tell them that?
Right. Yep, good point. Next question is, what were the KKK trials of 1872 that you referenced earlier?
The KKK trials of 1872?
Yeah.
I think that might refer to during the administration of Ulysses S. Grant. There were 3 enforcement acts that were passed to try and either outlaw or at least rein in the activities of the Ku Klux Klan. So I think that may be what I'm talking about.
Okay. Next question is, what is your attitude about some current calls for reparations for Blacks or Native Americans?
You know what? Let me put it to you like this. Now, the precedent for reparations has usually been easily digested when the people who suffer whatever the wrong was are alive to still be compensated for it. Take, for example, Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. Now, they're decreasing in number, but most people go like, okay, you know what? We interned American citizens. That was, you know, people shouldn't have done it. They were being motivated by hate, fear, bigotry. Back then, these were American citizens. They lost their businesses, their homes, their livelihoods. Yes, let's compensate them. Now, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a wonderful article in the Atlantic a few years ago. And again, I'll find that to you, send you the link, and you can send it to our HASP scholars about, he said, you know, basically, okay, look, okay, fine. You don't want to compensate the people who are descendants of slaves because slavery ended, what, over 150 years ago? What about the citizens of Chicago who had their homes burned down? Or people in Tulsa who lost their businesses and livelihoods in the 20th century? They're getting up in years, but they're still here. What about compensating them? What about World War II veterans who never had access to GI benefits? What about their descendants? So for the people, for the generations that are closer to us, I can see it, but I'm telling you, if there's ever a move to compensate Black folks for slavery, I'm out of here. Because these folk are insane now to live with. Can you imagine what would happen with that? So I mean, they're lying about a presidential election that the chief cybersecurity guy in 2020 said was the most secure in all of American history. I can't even imagine what they'd be willing to do as far as lying about that. And plus, you know, I've always been kind of bothered by trying to attach a dollar amount to the suffering of my ancestors in slavery. I don't know that you can do that. And I also have the suspicion, this is just me I'm speaking for. You know, I don't want to quantify that a relative of mine who went through that horrific experience is equal X dollars. What I want, you want reparations? You want to do reparations? How about this? How about once and for all, finally, doing what the Constitution says?
Point. All right, quickly, let me try typing to everyone. What was the website, the historical one that you recommended?
The National Museum
Yeah.
of African American History and Culture. The National Museum, NMAAHC. The National Museum,
NMAAHC.
National Museum, African American History and Culture.
Got it. All right, and then there was just a comment from Diana that the error in the 1619 project, which the author has acknowledged was not written by her, but was an introductory part.
Yes.
And then a question for Tom. Can you recommend any books about the Tulsa Race Massacre? And then just by the way, that it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan who said, "You're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts."
Thank you.
Okay.
That's you know, one of the joys I have teaching my HASP scholars today. You all know these people. If I said that to one of my usual clientele, like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, what's that, a fruit? But yeah, that's right. It was Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
But do you recommend any books about the Tulsa Race Massacre?
What I want to do first, Kim, I don't know. Hold on a second. What I recommend is adjunct to it, but I recommend everybody get this book. This is a book entitled Without Sanctuary.
Oh yeah.
Without Sanctuary. And now I warn you, it's a book that I think every HASP scholar would want to have, because you all are just that, you all like to be informed. It's this thick. And it is a book of nothing but lynching photographs. That's it. Nothing but lynching photographs. Another book is this one, Red Summer, about the summer of 1919. And it'll tell you about the Chicago race riots of 1919 and what happened also out in Nebraska and other parts of the nation. Woodrow Wilson gets a much deserved shellacking in this book. He was a terrible, terrible president and a marginal human being. Now the other one, there's a book entitled A Lynching in the Heartland. Lynching in the Heartland. And I'll have to find specific books, Kim, that deal with the Tulsa race riot.
Okay. Great. That's everything I have in the chat. So it is 11:06. If you need to go, we understand. Otherwise, if anybody else wants to ask a quick comment or question, please feel free to do so.
Please ask. All I have left to do until between now and noon is clean up after my dog.
I have a question for you, Fred. It's Kit. I believe you mentioned the little town in Florida called Rosewood.
Rosewood, Florida, yes.
Yes, and you may not have time to talk about it today, but I wonder if you could include that in
I have.
session 2 or session 3.
I have.
Because it is an interesting story, and I know you know more about it than I do. But
I have included it.
okay, good.
Rosewood occurs in 1923, 2 years after Tulsa. And again, it's another, just when you thought that Tulsa, but I'm going to also talk about East St. Louis in 1917.
Okay.
Because East St. Louis, the race riot that occurred there, is like the one that occurred in Memphis in 1866, in Colfax in 1868, and there's another one that in Atlanta in 1906, then East St. Louis 1917, Tulsa 1921, Rosewood in 1923. I mean, if you just look at the map, of these instances where white mobs went through black communities, raping, pillaging, plundering, committing arson, you know, I'll be straight up with you. There are times when I've been doing this research, I've had to stop because it's just overwhelming to think this has happened again and again and again, and no one was arrested, no one prosecuted, nobody held accountable. It's like, oh, well, it's just them, and people kept on moving. So we'll talk about them.
Okay, good. What we as scholars really appreciate, I'll speak for myself here, but you do teach history as it is. And we've always noticed that you give us the facts, the real facts, and not your own facts. And the other thing is that I feel what we learn from you is so often what it is not ever presented in any of our history books in high school, or at least in my high school. We learned some of the basics about some wars, but you teach us so much about what is not in our history books. And I for one, am so grateful for that. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's good to see you all. We'll see you next week.
Did I
Can
mention
Fred
that?
stay?
Okay. Did I mention that you all look good? See you later.
Fred, can you stay on a sec?
Sure.